since I've done one of these videos, but it's only been a couple weeks. So, anyway, today we are talking with Dr. Tom Grafton. Tom is a PhD in biblical studies with a specialization in New Testament and Greek languages, and he's a super smart guy. And we're going to talk a little bit today about Bible translations and interpretation and why any of that stuff matters and how to know if you're reading a good translation or not. And yeah, it's just, oh, and we're talking about some of the tools that can help us go a little bit deeper in our Bible study. And so, yeah, I think it's a really good, helpful conversation, and I hope you guys will enjoy it. I hope you guys are doing well. I am. I'm missing people. I think I'm. I was at the point at first where I was like, this is good. Like I'm getting some good family time, and then I got to the point where okay, I need to see some people, and then things started to open up, and it got a little crazy, and it's getting a little crazier every day. I feel like, and um, it just doesn't feel entirely normal yet. And so I'm ready for things to get back to normal. I don't know about y'all, but I hope you guys are doing well, and I hope you find this chat encouraging and you get something useful out of it and helping you study the Bible a little bit deeper. So thank you all. I'll see you soon. All right, guys, we are here with Tom Grafton, Dr. Tom Grafton, if you will. Tom and I went to seminary together. And so, Tom, thanks for being here. Can you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So we went to seminary together where I got my master's in biblical studies and then went on to get my PhD in biblical studies after that. And my focus was in New Testament studies, and I looked at a lot of Greek, looked at the Greek language quite a bit, and such. So I'll spare everyone the details because they get a little boring. Exciting for me, but married to my wife Joy, who also went to seminary with us.
Yep.
And we've got 4 daughters together, ages 8, 7, 3, and 1. And so if anybody is in need of eligible daughters, any sons out there you need married off, available in about 30 years. So, but yeah, we live down in Mobile, Alabama now. And so, yeah, that's
awesome. One of the things I remember is we were across the hall from each other, and I would always be watching stupid YouTube videos, and I would look over, and you were just pouring over the Greek language for hours and hours, and I would have to beg you to play cards or something because you were just nonstop studying.
I was serious about my studying.
Very serious. That's why you have a PhD and I don't.
That's true.
That's true. So I want to talk about biblical translation today. In today's world, there are literally hundreds of translations available at any time. You can go online and find any kind of translation you want. So my question is, with that being said, why would you suggest to somebody that the original languages are even important or necessary to kind of get into, if at all?
Yeah. So, my first off thing I think I would say is that I wouldn't say that the original languages are essential. I wouldn't say that you cannot understand the Bible unless you read the original languages, because most of us would have a serious problem if that were true. I think God can speak to us through any language. So, the most important thing is to be open to allowing Him to speak to us. But when we dive into the original languages, it just opens up the scriptures in a new way. It really gives us a new perspective and new insights into the culture of that time. And it helps us to understand, my sort of driving question or concern as I'm studying the scriptures is really what was God saying to those people in that time? What was He speaking to them, and how was He speaking to them? What did the stories mean to them? What do these words mean to them? how did they receive it in that time? Because I think God, the scriptures are really a record of God speaking to people in individual times and seasons, throughout a long period of history. So I think for us to really understand how God was speaking to them, it helps us understand how he may be speaking to us today and how to better recognize his voice. And so part of that is the original languages. They give us kind of an insight into the culture and the time. And I think anybody that's ever tried to, if anybody's actually studied another language, you realize that as you study the language, you come across words that don't translate perfectly over into English. You start to learn more about how people do things. You learn about their customs, their habits, the types of foods they eat, how they compliment each other, how they insult each other, how they do all sorts, how they interact in their language, and it teaches you about the culture. So I think the original languages can really give us another glimpse into how God was speaking to the people during those times.
Is this where you would say things like genre come into play?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So genre helps us, understand the types of writings and kind of the intent and the purpose. So the Gospels are most of the time classified as biography type genre. So if we understand that, then we start to look at and see some of the way the language is used to talk about Jesus and who Jesus was. Um, at the same time, then you get into the Gospel of Luke, who is kind of biography, but is also, he's been compared to the ancient historical writers, historiography. And so, you see some things in the language and how he writes that tell you that he's not just interested in the person of Jesus, but how the events unfolded, how they took place, and the order of the events and how things happen and transpire. That actually gives us some insights to how God was speaking to them in that time.
What about like mistranslation? Is that a fear for you? Is that something you see? Are there things that get lost in translation or mistranslated?
Yeah, a lot of things get lost in translation, so to speak. Like I said, if you've ever dealt with another language, you realize that not everything is a one-for-one correspondence. So sometimes you have to kind of pick and choose. Like if I say chair in English, I could use the word for chair in another language, in French or Spanish or whatever, and it'd be pretty easy to say, okay, that's a chair. But if you start to say, like in French, they have a word for the lendemain, which means the day after tomorrow. They actually have a word for that. In English, we don't really have a word for that. So it's not exactly a perfect correspondence.
Mm.
In Greek, I'm trying to think of a good example. When you talk about different translations, I like to look at like the Message translation a lot compared to more literal translations like the ESV or any of the other NIV, which is probably a little more interpretive maybe. But the Message translation is purposely very it's really a paraphrase. You'd really classify that as more of a paraphrase. Right. And I don't say that to be insulting to the Message at all. I think the Message is a great translation. It gives the purpose is to use language that we would use today, right? So if Jesus came to us today, what are the words and the sort of imagery that we would conjure up? And so one of the examples I like to think of is when Jesus talks about you can't put new wine into old wineskins. Well, in the Message translation, one part he says, instead of talking about that analogy, because what's a wineskin? Who puts wine in a wineskin? No, none of us do, right? And it doesn't matter what kind of bottle you put wine in, anyways. So it's not really an analogy that we understand real easily. You kind of have to explore and dig into the culture of the time, and so it takes a lot more digging to figure out what's being said. Well, so in the Message translation, he says, nobody pours cold water on a warm bonfire. Well, for those of us that have ever been in camp meetings or gone camping or, been on retreats or, any of that, we understand what a campfire means. It means a lot to us. It's a warm place. It's an inviting place. A lot of us have really good memories. We might share openly with each other. So the idea of a campfire or a bonfire stirs up certain imagery in us that we can all associate with. So the idea of somebody pouring water on that moment and kind of fizzling out that moment, it actually speaks to us. Whereas, somebody that hasn't had those experiences might not really understand it. So
it gives us a better understanding
Yeah. But at the same time, even the way he does that in the Message translation, you still lose a lot of what's you gain something, but you also lose something from what Jesus was saying, because he's talking about a transition between old and new. So, in one hand, it's really good because it gives us an imagery that we can associate with and understand. But on the other hand, it doesn't provide us with the entirety of what Jesus was saying with that imagery in the original. So, so with something like the Message, you have to treat it for what it is. It's not meant to necessarily give us everything that we need to understand, what was really originally being said in the scriptures, but it gives us some imagery that we can kind of grab hold of and understand.
Yeah. So yeah. Well, let me ask this, because it sounds like there's also the issue of interpretation, right? Mm-hmm. And so how does interpretation play into translation?
Yeah. So ideally, any of us that try to translate the scriptures, the kind of ideal is that we are not interpretive at all, that we're just trying to take what's being said in Greek and bring it into English so that anybody can read the English translation and understand what was originally being said. Same thing for the Hebrew and Aramaic parts of the Old Testament. We're just being faithful to what was being said then and moving that into what's being said today in English. Well, that's a nice ideal and it's a nice thought, but the reality is none of us can completely shed our interpretive lens for how we see things, right? So we're going to have to come to an interpretive decision, right? So one of these, and I forget which verse, but one that we talked about a lot in class and seminary was, I think it's in Romans, talking about the faith of Christ. So the faith of Christ is a literal translation of the Greek, but the way that grammatical construction is used in Greek, it could be interpreted as the faith of Christ in the sense of Christ's faith, right? Mm-hmm. So Christ had faith, so we are taking part, sharing in that faith, or it could be faith in Christ, right? Our faith in Christ. So is it talking about our faith in Christ, or is it talking about the faith that Christ had in God and in us? So right there, you can give kind of a wooden literal translation, but you have to make a decision, an interpretive decision about what you think it means. So every translation is going to have a certain amount of interpretation involved, right? But I think that the best we can do with a translation is try to give as much of the original meaning as possible, and without being overtly interpretive. We have to make some decisions, but also allowing for the fact that we may not be right. So that's why a lot of times there's footnotes in your translation. I'm always interested, so I'm always looking at footnotes. Where they say it could also be interpreted this way, it could be translated this way. So when I see that to me that's a good thing, because it shows some transparency with the translator to say, well, I may not have this completely right, but this is another possibility.
So that brings up a good question, is how do you know what to trust as far as different translations go? How do you know that? What's a telltale sign of a good translation or a bad translation?
Yeah. So my sort of litmus test that I use is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, because there's a portion what Paul is doing when he writes that part And this is where he says, now concerning the matters you wrote. And then he starts to list, and they're spread out over several chapters, but he starts to list some of the things they wrote. So he says, now concerning the things you wrote, it is not good for a man to lay with a wife or to lay with a woman. Of course, even the word woman or the word in Greek could be woman or wife. It could mean woman or wife. Same thing with man, could be man or husband. So you have to kind of figure out, is he talking about husband and wife? Is it talking about just a man and a woman? That chapter, depending on the translation, some translations miss altogether because I used to actually read it thinking that Paul was saying it's not good for a man to lay with a woman. But that's not what he's saying. He's saying that's what they wrote to him, and he's responding back to what they said. So a good translation, I think, will catch that and be able to express that. So that's kind of my personal litmus test that I use there. Other people have different concerns. They might want to make sure that the translation is not being too academic or scholarly. It's understanding the importance of faith. So part of that, to go along with that, it's not always an issue of a good or bad translation. It's an issue of what's the purpose of the translation. So, we talk about the message, as long as you understand that this is meant to be very, very interpretive, very modern sort of language, versus like something like that. NASB tends to be pretty literal. And then you've
literal as in word for word, like trying to
more word for word. So it's going to sound like a little weird. Like it doesn't sound like the way we talk in English all the time. But then you've got, like, I grew up reading in my high school years. I was reading my Bible I got in third grade, I guess it was, and it was a Revised Standard Version from like the 60s or 70s, and it was like talking about girding your loins, and there's all this language I didn't really understand.
Right.
And I didn't realize till I got to college and people are reading the NIV, and it's like, oh, this sounds very different. So understanding, some translations are a little older. There's even there's a TNIV now, so it's even an update on the NIV. So just understanding that that there's older translations, and understanding that some may be a little more literal. They may sound a little more awkward in English. So if you want something a little more smoother, there's like a ESV or NIV, NRSV, there's King James. They're all a little more readable in English.
Yeah. Well, one last question before we go. First off, thank you for doing this. What are some tools that you might suggest to people who are interested in learning more about Bible translation or original languages, or just trying to learn more about the scriptures in general? What are some of the tools that you would recommend to people?
Yeah. So depending on kind of what level you want to dig into, you can always go the route of commentaries if there's a certain book that you're interested in. There's like a Word Biblical Commentary, Anchor Bible Commentary. I think NIV has a commentary series. So there's those are good if you're looking at a particular book. And there's always going to be like an introduction section that's going to really dig in and kind of talk a little more general about the translation, certain there's textual issues. So all the different manuscripts of the Bible that have passed down through the years, they'll talk about some of the differences between them, which is usually very, very minor. So commentaries can always be a place to turn, although that's going to be more on the academic, scholarly side of things. If you're not interested in being quite so technical, like Logos, if you are able to purchase some Logos Bible software, they've got a lot of stuff on there, all kinds of resources that, in a range from the, more easier to understand versus more technical stuff. And so they've got a lot of stuff on there that can talk about these different issues and kind of give a little bit of guidance.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it and look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.